Chapter 3, Part A, The Power of State. It is the mind that maketh good or ill, that maketh wretch or happy, rich or poor. Edmund Spencer. Have you ever had the experience of being on a roll, the feeling that you could do no wrong, a time when everything seemed to go right? Maybe it was a tennis match when every shot hit the line, or a business meeting where you had all the answers. Maybe it was a time when you amazed yourself by doing something heroic or dramatic you never thought you could do. You've probably had the opposite experience too, a day when nothing went right. You can probably remember times you messed up things you usually do easily, when every step was wrong, every door was locked, everything you tried turned out wrong. What's the difference? You're the same person. You should have the same resources at your disposal. So why do you produce dismal results one time and fabulous results the next? Why do even the best athletes have days when they do everything right and follow them with days when they can't buy a basket or a base hit? The difference is the neurophysiological state you're in. There are enabling states, confidence, love, inner strength, joy, ecstasy, belief, that tap great well springs of personal power. There are paralyzing states, confusion, depression, fear, anxiety, sadness, frustration, that leave us powerless. We all go in and out of good and bad states. Have you ever gone into a restaurant and had a waitress snarl, "What'd you want?" Do you think she always communicates like that? It's possible that she's had such a difficult life that she's always like that. But it's more likely that she's had a bad day handling too many tables, maybe stiffed by a few customers. She's not a bad person. She's just in a terribly unresourceful state. If you can change her state, you can change her behavior. Understanding state is the key to understanding change and achieving excellence. Our behavior is the result of the state we're in. We always do the best we can with the resources available to us, but sometimes we find ourselves in unresourceful states. I know there have been times in my life when, while in a particular state, I did or said things that later I regretted or was embarrassed about. Maybe you have too. It's important to remember these times when someone treats you poorly. Thus, you create a sense of compassion instead of anger. After all, those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Remember, the waitress and other people are not their behaviors. The key, then, is to take charge of our states and thus our behaviors. What if you could snap your fingers and go into the most dynamic, resourceful state at will? A state in which you're excited, you're sure of success, your body is crackling with energy, your mind is alive. Well, you can. By the time you finish this book, you're going to know how to put yourself into your most resourceful, empowering states and get yourself out of your disempowering states whenever you choose. Remember, the key to power is taking action. My goal is to share with you how to use the states that lead to decisive, congruent, committed action. In this chapter, we're going to learn what states are, how they work, and we're going to learn why we can control our states to make them work for us. A state can be defined as the sum of the millions of neurological processes happening within us. In other words, the sum total of our experience at any moment in time. Most of our states happen without any conscious direction on our part. We see something, and we respond to it by going into a state. It may be a resourceful and useful state, or an unresourceful and limiting state, but there's not much that most of us do to control it. The difference between those who fail to achieve their goals in life and those who succeed is the difference between those who cannot put themselves in a supportive state and those who can consistently put themselves in a state that supports them in their achievements. Almost everything people want is some possible state. Make a list of the things you want in life. Do you want love? Well, love is a state, a feeling or emotion we signal to ourselves and feel within ourselves based on certain stimuli from the environment. Confidence? Respect? They're all things that we create. We produce these states within ourselves. Maybe you want money. Well, you don't care about having little pieces of green paper adorned with the faces of assorted deceased notables. You want what money represents to you, the love, confidence, freedom, or whatever states you think it can help provide. So the key to love, the key to joy, the key to the one power that man has sought for years, the ability to direct his life, is the ability to know how to direct and manage your states. The first key to directing your state and producing the results you desire in life is to learn to effectively run your brain. In order to do this, we need to understand a little bit about how it works. We need to know what creates a state in the first place. For centuries, man has been fascinated by ways to alter his states, and thus his experience of life. He has tried fasting, drugs, ritual, music, sex, food, hypnosis, chanting. These things all have their uses and their limitations. However, you are now going to be opened up to much simpler ways that are equally powerful and in many cases quicker and more precise. If all behavior is the result of the state we're in, we may produce different communications and behaviors when we're in resourceful states than we will when we are in an unresourceful one. Then the next question is, what creates the state we're in? There are two main components of state. The first is our internal representations, and the second is the condition and use of our physiology. What and how you picture things, as well as what and how you say things to yourself about the situation at hand, create the state you're in, and thus the kinds of behaviors you produce. For example, how do you treat your spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend when he or she comes home much later than promised? Well, Your behavior will greatly depend on the state you're in when your loved one returns, and your state to a large degree will be determined by what you have been representing in your mind as the reason for the delay. If for hours you had been picturing this person you care about in an accident, bloody, dead, or hospitalized, as the person walks in the door, you may greet him or her with tears or a sigh of relief, or a big hug and a question of what happened. These behaviors spring from a state of concern. However, if instead you pictured your loved one having a clandestine affair, or if you told yourself over and over that this person is late simply because he or she just doesn't care about your time or feelings, then, when your loved one arrives home, you will give him or her a far different reception as a result of your state. Out of a state of feeling angry or feeling used, a whole new set of behaviors results. The next obvious question is, what causes one person to represent things out of a state of concern, while another creates internal representations that put her in a state of distrust or anger? Well, there are many factors. We may have modeled the reactions of our parents or other role models to such experiences. If, for example, when you were a child, your mother always worried when your father came home late, you may also represent things in a way that worries you. If your mother talked of how she couldn't trust your father, you may have modeled that pattern. Thus, our beliefs, attitudes, values, and past experiences with the particular person all affect the kinds of representations we will make about their behaviors. There is an even more important and powerful factor in how we perceive and represent the world, and that is the condition and our pattern of use of our own physiology. Things like muscle tension, what we eat, how we breathe, our posture, our overall level of biochemical functioning, all have a huge impact on our state. Internal representation and physiology work together in a cybernetic loop. Anything that affects one will automatically affect the other. So changing states involves changing internal representation and changing physiology. If, when your lover, spouse, child is supposed to be home, your body is in a resourceful state, you will probably perceive that person as being stuck in traffic or on the way home. If, however, you are for various reasons in a physiological state of great muscular tension or extremely tired, or if you are experiencing pain or low blood sugar, you will tend to represent things to yourself in a way that may magnify your negative feelings. Think of it. When you're feeling physically vibrant and totally alive, don't you perceive the world differently than when you're tired or sick? The condition of your physiology literally changes the way you represent and thus experience the world. When you perceive things as being difficult or upsetting, doesn't your body follow suit and become tense? So these two factors, internal representations and physiology, are constantly interacting with each other to create the state we are in, and the state we are in determines the type of behavior we produce. Thus, to control and direct our behaviors, we must control and direct our states, and to control our states, we must control and consciously direct our internal representations and physiologies. Just imagine being able to be 100% in control of your state in any moment in time. Before we can direct our experiences of life, we must first understand how we experience. As mammals, humans receive and represent information about their environment through specialized receptors and sense organs. There are 5 senses: gustation or taste, olfaction or smell, vision or sight, audition or hearing, and kinesthesis or feeling. We make most of the decisions that affect our behavior primarily using only 3 of these senses: the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic systems. These specialized receptors transmit external stimuli to the brain. Through the process of generalization, distortion, and deletion, the brain then takes these electrical signals and filters them into an internal representation. Thus, your internal representation, your experience of the event, isn't precisely what happened, but rather a personalized internal representation. The conscious mind of an individual can't use all the signals being sent to it. You would probably go stark raving mad if you consciously had to make sense of thousands of stimuli, ranging from the pulse of blood through your left finger to the vibration of your ear. So the brain filters and stores the information it needs, or expects to need later, and allows the conscious mind of the individual to ignore the rest. This filtering process explains the huge range in human perception. 2 people can see the same traffic accident, but give utterly different accounts of it. One may have paid more attention to what he saw, another to what he heard. They saw it from different angles. They both have different physiologies to begin the perception process with in the first place. One may have 20/20 vision, while another may have poor physical resources in general. Perhaps one had been in an accident himself and had a vivid representation already stored. Whatever the case, the two will have very different representations of the same event, and they'll go on to store those perceptions and internal representations as new filters through which they will experience things in the future. There's an important concept that's used in NLP. The map is not the territory. As Alfred Korzybski noted in his Science and Sanity, important characteristics of maps should be noted. A map is not the territory it represents, but, if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory, which accounts for its usefulness. The meaning for individuals is that their internal representation is not a precise rendering of an event. It's just one interpretation, as filtered through specific personal beliefs, attitudes, values, and something called meta-programs. Perhaps this is why Einstein once said, Whoever undertakes to set himself up as a judge in the field of truth and knowledge is shipwrecked by the laughter of the gods. Since we don't know how things really are, but only how we represent them to ourselves, why not represent them in a way that empowers ourselves and others, rather than creating limitations? The key to doing this successfully is memory management, the forming of representations that consistently create the most empowering states for an individual. In any experience, you have many things you can focus on. Even the most successful person can think of what isn't working and go into a state of depression or frustration or anger, or he can focus on all the things that work in his life. No matter how terrible a situation is, you can represent it in a way that empowers you. Successful people are able to gain access to their most resourceful state on a consistent basis. Isn't that the difference between people who succeed and people who don't? Think back to W. Mitchell. It wasn't what happened to him that mattered. It was the way he represented what happened. Despite being terribly burned and then paralyzed, he found a way to put himself in a resourceful state. Remember, nothing is inherently bad or good. Value is how we represent it to ourselves. We can represent things in a way that puts us in a positive state, or we can do the opposite. Take a moment to think of a time when you have been in a powerful state. That's what we do in the Firewalk. If I asked you to put down this book and walk across a bed of hot coals, I doubt you would get up and do it. It's not something you believe you can do, and you may not have associated resourceful feelings and states with that task. So when I speak of it, you would probably not go into a state that would support you in taking that action. The Firewalk teaches people how to change their states and their behaviors in a way that empowers them to take action and produce new results in spite of fear or other limiting factors. People who walk on fire aren't different from the way they were when they came in the door thinking firewalking was impossible, but they've learned how to change their physiology, and they have learned to change their internal representations about what they can or cannot do, so that walking on fire is transformed from something terrifying to something they know they can do. They now can put themselves in a totally resourceful state, and from that state, they can produce many actions and results that in the past they had labeled impossible. The Firewalk helps people form a new internal representation of possibility. If this thing that had seemed so impossible was only a limitation in their mind, then what other impossibilities are really very possible as well? It's one thing to talk about the power of state, it's another to experience it. That's what the Firewalk does. It provides a new model for belief and for possibility, and it creates a new internal feeling or state association for people, one that makes their lives work better and enables them to do more than they ever thought possible before. It clearly demonstrates to them that their behavior is the result of the state they're in, for in one moment, by making a few changes in how they represent the experience to themselves, they can become so totally confident that they can take effective action. Obviously, there are many ways to do this. The Firewalk is just one dramatic and fun way that people rarely forget. The key to producing the results you desire, then, is to represent things to yourself in a way that puts you in such a resourceful state that you're empowered to take the types and qualities of actions that create your desired outcomes. Failure to do this will usually mean failure even to attempt that which you desire, or at best a feeble, half-hearted attempt that will produce like results. If I say to you, let's walk on fire, the stimuli I produce for you, in words and in body language, go to your brain, where you form a representation. If you picture people with rings through their noses taking part in some terrible rite, or people burning at the stake, you won't be in a very good state. If you form a representation of yourself burning, your state will be even worse. However, if you were to picture people clapping and dancing and celebrating together, if you saw a scene of total joy and excitement, you would be in a very different state. If you saw a representation of yourself walking healthfully and joyously, and if you were to say, yes, I absolutely can do this, and move your body as if you were totally confident, then these neurological signals would put you in a state where you would most likely take action and walk. Chapter 3, Part B. The same is true for everything in life. If we represent to ourselves that things aren't going to work, they won't. If we form a representation that things will work, then we create the internal resources we need to produce the state that will support us in producing positive results. The difference between a Ted Turner, a Lee Iacocca, a W. Mitchell, and other people is that they represent the world as a place where they can produce any result they truly desire most. Obviously, even in the best state, we do not always produce the results we desire, but when we create the appropriate state, we create the greatest possible chance for using all our resources effectively. The next logical question is, if internal representations and physiology work together to create the state from which behaviors spring, what determines the specific kind of behavior we produce when we're in that state? One person in a state of love will hug you, while another will just tell you she loves you. The answer is, when we go into a state, our brain then accesses possible behavioral choices. The number of choices is determined by our models of the world. Some people, when they get angry, have one major model of how to respond, so they may lash out as they learn to do by watching their parents. Or maybe they just tried something and it seemed to get them what they wanted, so that became a stored memory of how to respond in the future. We all have worldviews, models that shape our perceptions of our environment. From people we know, and from books and movies and television, we form an image of the world and what's possible in it. In W. Mitchell's case, one thing that shaped his life was the memory of a man he knew as a kid, a man who was paralyzed but made his life a triumph. So Mitchell had a model that helped him represent his situation as something that in no way prevented him from being utterly successful. What we need to do in modeling people is to find out the specific beliefs that cause them to represent the world in a way that allows them to take effective action. We need to find out exactly how they represent to themselves their experience of the world. What do they do visually in their minds? What do they say? What do they feel? Once again, if we produce the same exact messages in our bodies, we can produce similar results. That's what modeling is all about. One of the constants in life is that results are always being produced. If you don't consciously decide what results you want to produce and represent things accordingly, then some external trigger, a conversation, a TV show, whatever, may create states that create behaviors that do not support you. Life is like a river. It's moving, and you can be at the mercy of the river if you don't take deliberate, conscious action to steer yourself in a direction you have predetermined. If you don't plant the mental and physiological seeds of the results you want, weeds will grow automatically. If we don't consciously direct our own minds and states, our environment may produce undesirable, haphazard states. The results can be disastrous. Thus, it's critical that, on a daily basis, we stand guard at the door of our mind, that we know how we are consistently representing things to ourselves. We must daily weed our garden. One of the most powerful examples of being in an undesirable state is the story of Karl Wallenda of the Flying Wallendas. He had performed aerial routines for years with great success, never considering the possibility of failure. Falling was just not part of his mental makeup. Then, a few years back, he suddenly began mentioning to his wife that he had started to see himself falling. For the first time, he had begun to consistently give himself a representation of falling. 3 months after he first started talking about it, he fell to his death. Some people would say he had a premonition. Another viewpoint is that he gave his nervous system a consistent representation, a signal that put him in a state that supported the behavior of falling. He created an outcome. He gave his brain a new path to follow, and eventually it did. This is why it is so critical to focus in life on what we want versus what we don't want. If you continually focus on all bad things in life, all the things you don't want, or all the possible problems, you put yourself in a state that supports those types of behaviors and results. For example, are you a jealous person? No, you are not. You may in the past have produced jealous states and the types of behaviors that spring from them. However, you are not your behavior. By making these kinds of generalizations about yourself, you create a belief that will govern and direct your actions in the future. Remember, your behavior is the result of your state, and your state is the result of your internal representations and your physiology, both of which you can change in a matter of moments. If in the past you have been jealous, that simply means that you have represented things in a way that created this state. You now can represent things in a new way and produce new states and accompanying behaviors. Remember, we always have a choice of how to represent things to ourselves. If you represent to yourself that your lover is cheating on you, pretty soon you will find yourself in a state of rage and anger. Bear in mind, you have no evidence this is true, but you experience it in your body as if it were, so that by the time the person you love comes home, you're suspicious or angry. In this state, how do you treat the person you love? Usually not very well. You may abuse or attack him or her verbally, or just feel bad inside and create some other retaliatory behavior later on. Remember, the person you love may not have done anything, but the kind of behavior that you produce out of such a state will probably make him or her want to be with someone else. If you're jealous, you create that state. You can change your pictures of negativity to images of your loved one working hard to get home. This new picturing process will put you in a state where when your loved one does make it home, you will behave in a way that will make him or her feel wanted and will thus increase the desire to be with you. There may be times when a lover really is doing what you pictured, but why waste lots of emotion until you find out for sure? Most of the time, it's highly unlikely that it's true, yet you've created all kinds of pain for both of you, and for what? The ancestor of every action is a thought. Ralph Waldo Emerson. If we take control of our own communication with ourselves and produce visual, auditory, and kinesthetic signals of what we do want, outstanding positive results can be consistently produced, even in situations where the odds for success seem limited or non-existent. The most powerful and effective managers, coaches, parents, and motivators are those who can represent the circumstances of life to themselves and to others in a way that signals success to the nervous system in spite of seemingly hopeless external stimuli. They keep themselves and others in a state of total resourcefulness so that they can continue to take action until they succeed. You've probably heard about Mel Fisher. He's the man who for 17 years searched for an undersea buried treasure, finally discovering over $400 million worth of gold and silver bullion. In an article I read about him, one of the crew members was asked why he had stayed on so long. He replied that Mel just had the ability to get everyone excited. Every day, Fisher told himself and the crew, today's the day, and at the end of the day, tomorrow's the day. But just saying it was not enough. He also said it congruently. in his tone of voice, the pictures in his mind, and his feelings. Every day, he put himself in state so that he would continue to take action until he succeeded. He's a classic example of the ultimate success formula. He knew his outcome, he took action, he learned from what worked, and if it didn't, he tried something else until he succeeded. One of the best motivators I know is Dick Tomey, head football coach at the University of Hawaii. He truly understands how people's internal representations affect their performance. Once, in a game against the University of Wyoming, his team was being pushed all over the field. At halftime, the score was 22-0, and his team didn't look as though it belonged on the same field with Wyoming. You can imagine what kind of state Tomey's players were in when they trooped into the locker room at halftime. He took one look at their bowed heads and sunken expressions and realized that unless he changed their state, they didn't have a prayer in the second half. From the physiology they were in, they would be caught in a loop of feeling like failures, and out of that state, they would not have the resources to succeed. So Dick brought out a poster board of mimeographed articles that he had been collecting over the years. Each of the articles described teams that had been behind by a similar or larger margin and had rallied against these seemingly impossible odds to win the games. By having his players read the articles, he managed to instill a whole new belief, a belief that they really could come back, and that belief, internal representation, created a whole new neurophysiological state. What happened? Tomey's team came back in the second half and played the game of its life, holding Wyoming scoreless in the entire second half and winning 27-22. They did it because he was able to change their internal representations, their beliefs about what was possible. Not long ago, I was on a plane with Ken Blanchard, the co-author of The 1 Minute Manager. He'd just written an article for Golf Digest entitled The 1 Minute Golfer. He had hooked up with one of the top golf instructors in the United States, and as a result, he'd improved his score. He said he had learned all sorts of useful distinctions, but was having trouble remembering them all. I told him he didn't have to grope for the distinctions. Instead, I asked him if he had ever hit a golf ball perfectly. He told me that of course he had. I asked if he had done this on many occasions. He said that of course he had. Then I explained that strategy or specific way of organizing his resources had clearly been recorded in his unconscious. All he needed to do was put himself back into the state where he made use of all that information he already had. I spent a few minutes teaching him how to get in that state and then how to re-trigger it on cue. You'll learn this technique in Chapter 17. What happened? He went out and played the best round he'd played in 15 years, knocking 15 strokes off his previous round. Why? Because there's no power like the power of a resourceful state. He didn't need to struggle to remember. He had access to everything he needed. He just had to learn to tap into it. Remember, human behavior is the result of the state we're in. If you've ever produced a successful result, you can reproduce it by taking the same mental and physical actions you did then. Before the 1984 Olympics, I worked with Michael O'Brien, a swimmer who competed in the 1500 freestyle. He had been practicing, but felt as if he were not really putting his all into gearing up to succeed. He had developed a series of mental blocks that seemed to be limiting him. He had some fear about what success might mean, and thus his goal was the bronze or maybe the silver medal. He was not the favored swimmer to win the gold. The favorite, George DeCarlo, had beaten Michael on several occasions. I spent an hour and a half with Michael and helped him to model his peak performance states, that is, to discover how he got himself into his most resourceful physiologies, what he had pictured, what he had said to himself, and what he had felt in the one match in which he'd beaten George DeCarlo. We began to break down what actions he took, mentally and physically, when he won matches. We linked the state he was in at these times to an automatic trigger, the sound of the starting gun firing. I found out that the one day he had beaten George DeCarlo, he had been listening to Huey Lewis and the news right before starting. So the day of the Olympic finals, he did everything the same actions he had taken on the day he had won, even listening to Huey Lewis moments beforehand, and he beat George DeCarlo and won the gold medal by a full 6 seconds. Did you ever see the film The Killing Fields? There was an amazing scene in it I'll never forget, involving a kid of perhaps 12 or 13 living amid the awful chaos and destruction of war in Cambodia. At one point, in utter frustration, he picked up a machine gun and just blew someone away. It's a shocking scene. How in the world, you wonder, does a 12-year-old kid reach the point where he can do something like that? Well, two things happen. The first is that he's so frustrated that he's gone into a state where he's tapped into terrible, violent depths in his personality. The second is that he lives in a culture so permeated with war and destruction that picking up a machine gun seems an appropriate response. He's seen others do it, and he does it too. It's a terrible, negative scene. I try to concentrate on more positive states, but it's a dramatic summation of how we can do things in one state, good or bad, we'd never do in another. I'm emphasizing this over and over so it is embedded within you. The kind of behavior people produce is the result of the state they are in. How they specifically respond out of that state is based on their models of the world, that is, their stored neurological strategies. I could not have made Michael O'Brien win the Olympic gold medal. He had to work most of his life to store the strategies, the muscle responses, and so forth. But what I could do is find out how he could summon his most effective resources, his success strategies, on cue and in the key minutes he needed them. Most people take very little conscious action to direct their states. They wake up depressed or they wake up energized. Good breaks lift them up, bad ones bring them down. One difference between people in any field is how effectively they marshal their resources. It's most clear in athletics. No one succeeds all the time, but there are certain athletes who have the ability to put themselves in a resourceful state, almost on cue, who almost always rise to the occasion. Why did Reggie Jackson hit all those October home runs? How did Larry Bird or Jerry West develop the uncanny ability to hit all those shots at the buzzer? They were able to summon up their best when they needed it, when the pressure was the greatest. State change is what most people are after. They want to be happy, joyous, ecstatic, centered. They want peace of mind, or they're trying to get away from states they do not like. They feel frustrated, angry, upset, bored. So what do most people do? Well, they turn on a TV set that gives them new representations they can internalize. So now they see something and laugh. They're no longer in their frustrated state. They go out and eat, or they smoke a cigarette or take a drug. On a more positive note, they might exercise. The only problem with most of these approaches is that the results are not lasting. When the TV show is over, they still have the same internal representations about their life. They remember them and feel bad again after the excess food or drug has been consumed. There's now a price to pay for the temporary state change. By contrast, this book will show you how to directly change your internal representations and physiology without the use of external devices, which many times create additional problems in the long run. Why do people use drugs? Not because they like sticking needles in their arms, but because they like the experience and don't know any other way to get into that state. I've had kids who were hardcore drug users kick the habit after a firewalk because they were given a more elegant model of how to achieve the same high. One kid who said he'd been on heroin for 6.5 years finished the firewalk and told the group, "It's over. I never felt anything from a needle that even comes close to what I felt on the other side of those coals." That didn't mean he had to walk on fire regularly. He just had to regularly access this new state. By doing something that was impossible, he helped model for a kid that he could feel good. People who have achieved excellence are masters of tapping into the most resourceful parts of their brain. That's what separates them from the pack. The key thing to remember from this chapter is that your state has awesome power, and you can control it. You don't have to be at the mercy of whatever comes your way. There is a factor that determines in advance how we will represent our experience of life, a factor that filters the way we represent the world to ourselves, a factor that determines the kinds of states we will consistently enter in certain situations. It has been called the greatest power